Hi, everybody. Thank you. I know some people's volume or audio is getting adjusted. Thank you all for joining us. I'm Aisha Hardaway, one of the co-directors of the Social Justice Institute. My colleague Mark Chupp is also on the line here with us. I am delighted to introduce to you my colleague, Dean Bryan Adamson. He is a Case Western alum from the law school who has returned back after too long in Seattle. He has graciously taken us up on an offer to join us here as our Associate Dean for Diversity and Inclusion at the law school. And his research most recently on protesting, I thought was particularly critical for this, for SJI's 10th anniversary. And so I'm going to turn it over to Dean Adamson. Our goal is to finish, just so everybody knows, our goal is to finish at 1:55 so that you have a chance for a break, a quick bio break before we have sessions at 2. So thank you so much, Dean Adamson. It's all yours.
All right. Thank you very much, Professor Hardaway. Thank you and Professor Chupp and all the other organizers of this anniversary. It's a pleasure to be a part of it. It's a pleasure to be invited, and it's a pleasure to be amongst so many wonderful colleagues, new colleagues. So I'd like to get started, and I believe that I'm assured that we will be able to have enough time for Q&A as we proceed. So let me, I'm going to go to my share screen. All right. Can you see the screen? All right, great, fantastic. All right. So title of my presentation, Protesting While Black, the Fourth Estate, that is the news media, protest scripts, and how mass media legitimizes state violence against marginalized groups.
Bryan?
I'm sorry?
Yeah, unfortunately, it's showing the presentation view, so it's showing your notes and all of that.
Oh, okay, well, that's okay. Let me see if I can change that. Let's see. Okay. All right. Let me. There's no big deal to me if that is the. If you see that, if you happen to see it, but if it's not.
Yeah, please just proceed as you were. If you're fine with it.
Yeah, if it's okay, if it's not too distracting to you all, I'm okay with it.
No, it's fine. You can also slide over the, once you get in there, you can minimize the stuff to the right of the screen. Oh, yeah. Look at that. It looks like we're okay here.
Yeah.
Okay.
Can you see it all right?
Yeah, this looks fine. Absolutely. Please.
Okay, great. All right. So thank you. Yeah, so this is this is what I posit here. I want us to really focus on the power of media, and more importantly, the power of media to construct reality for us and the impact of that construction. I also want us to consider the institutions that are involved or engaged in the creation and articulation of narratives, specifically as they regard Black claims making through protest, and certainly as they regard Blacks and the associations that the media constructs regarding crime and criminality. And I advance this idea that the protests that are engaged in by Blacks and allies, looking at and railing against systemic racism and arguing for systemic and institutional change, represents an existential and institutional threat to the majoritarian institutions, not just the police departments and the criminal system, but also the mass media as an institution itself, that these claims making represent a threat to that as well. And because of that threat, the claims making by these marginalized groups, such as Blacks, and in our context, most recent context, the Black Lives Matter protests emerging out of the George Floyd murder and the other countless injustices, Breonna Taylor, et cetera, that the tropes of many major media outlets tend to derogate or sublimate the claims made by the marginalized groups in favor of violence. This also, I posit, leads to why the media itself supports the hyper-militarization of law enforcement. And we see what that does in the context of protests. But the fact that there is an interrelationship between the media storytelling and hyper-militarization go into reinforcing this my position that media is an agent of social control. I arrive at that by this theory, this mass media theory that is not uncommon, called agenda setting. And agenda setting is defined as the selection and descriptive choices and narrative conventions that the media engages to tell us what to think about, if not what to think. And it is the engagement of just basic heuristics of news gathering and the creation and construction of news stories. The heuristics involved in selection of news stories events a bias that is informed by the storyteller. I also argue that there's also a descriptive bias that goes into the articulation and construction of stories. It's important to just sort of break it down fundamentally in terms of what news narratives are. Particularly, it's important when we're looking at protests, is to think about the creation, the construction, and the articulation of crime in news media and the use of crime scripts. And this framing convention also becomes essential when we're talking about these things. Crime scripts have basically 5 components. There's violence. It is episodic, that is to say, it is a one-off, it is an event. There's an agent, there are a recurring set of figures, and they are typically sourced through institutional agents and institutional artifacts. So, a typical basic crime story. At 11:30 p.m. last night, a man was walking down the street and an unidentified gunman shot and killed him. Right? That is the typical story you might see on the 11 o'clock news or the 5 o'clock news running the next day. Marked by those things. It's a violent act. It happens once. That is, it is episodic. It's something that's captured in a bottle. There's an agent involved. There is a protagonist. There is a victim, right? And there's usually a recurring set of figures like a victim, like an assailant, or a police officer or official who is quoted in the story, right? And that's an example of being sourced through institutional agents, and institutional artifacts would be the fact that most crime news relies upon journalists and their peers, who are called runners, who go to the court every day and may scour the court reports, what hearings are coming up, or will go to the police departments and look at police reports and use those police reports, use those court information, those court artifacts as a way of building and constructing their news stories. The impact of that, as we can perhaps surmise, is the fact that the predominant narratives, the privileged narratives around crime, and that appears on news and in the news, is constructed from an institutional perspective, because the foundation of it is from our criminal system and our law enforcement systems. And so those narratives that are inherently biased, and often because Blacks are disproportionately engaged or involved in police encounters and in the court criminal system, those narratives that are constructed out of those reports and artifacts tend to be privileged, against which all other narratives have to contest, right? In articulating the stories, there are so many ways, so many conventions that media use in constructing their stories, and I just named several here, from the lead, the kicker, which is the might be a subheading under a title heading of a news story, who they interview, the quotes that they pull to highlight and make prominent in the story, the naming of source affiliation, the screen chirons. All of these framing conventions allow the media to signal to us what is salient, what is important from their perspective, right? And so these basic structures of news gathering and news writing are important in talking about this phenomenon, this issue, right? And the framing devices, not just the conventions, but devices, use of metaphors, use of catchphrases, visual imagery, right? If a story is extensive enough, we don't see this so much in radio or television, where a newsreader might be given 90 seconds to tell a story. We often don't get the conversations about the roots or consequences or appeal to morals in stories, particularly as they regard Black claims making and the protests that we've been seeing since the summer. Right. So, just an example of how media construction of news stories arguably impact the way in which we take it. So we see here two different sentences where the active versus passive voice is very critical here, right? So the difference between saying, a month after George Floyd was killed, protesters who sometimes clashed violently with police continue to fill the streets of Philadelphia and cities around the world, right? Versus a month after police killed George Floyd, the streets of Philadelphia and cities around the world continue to be filled with sometimes violent clashes between police and protesters. We see that in the first sentence, which was an actual lead in an article, news article, is passive, where there's no relationship between the police conduct and George Floyd's killing, right? And in that first sentence also, protesters are the antagonists, right? More so than in the second sentence. So that's just one example in which the way in which construction of stories tell us or signal to us how to think about what's happening in the world. Here's just a few more of examples where the police conduct is almost disengaged from the actual killing of George Floyd in the first instance, all right? And centering, that second sentence, for example, centering the protesters as the antagonists in the destruction of property, right? And that third example as well, doing the same thing, right? And then in the final example, we have the protesters who are clashing with the police. So I say here, The selection bias, and get back to the selection bias and the descriptive bias, is this idea that that media, that journalists and writers, they are infused with a type of selection bias because of their needs, not only on their own personal biases, but also the needs that are imperative as part of a media company. Selection bias, for example, is when a journalist may make an observation and immediately, cognitively, and sometimes even unconsciously, however, go into the decision-making heuristics about the story, the who, what, when, where, why. Is this story, if I'm a television news reporter, I'm gonna ask myself, does this story have visual dynamism? Is it something that pops, right? Is it a crime? Is it bloody? Is there, are there clear participants in the story? So all of those questions go into the bias in which the selection bias of any news story. And then, as we were just seeing, then it goes into the descriptive biases, how the use of the active and passive voice, the framing conventions, all go into impacting how the story is described and the message that is being sent through the story. Important to note is that the protest story hews very closely to the crime story. There is a paradigm that one can see as it regards the way in which protests are covered by the news media. And they're by and large treated as crime news, right? Episodic protagonists, they focus on violence and they have institutional agents who are usually featured in the stories. They have war and disruption frames and tropes, chaos, right? And hypermilitarization. Oftentimes, these stories will focus on the protesters' appearance or the theater nature of the protest. It might be chants. It might be a die-in. It might be a hands up, don't shoot, symbolic behavior. And so the stories around protests often do that. Stories around protests often also invoke public opinion. I'm sure we've all read or seen stories where they're talking about a protest where demonstrators are marching down the streets, and then the news reporter will cut away to an observer and say, hey, what do you think was going on here? And that observer might say something like, oh, this just ruined my day because I can't get to work, right? And in doing so, consciously even, news stories and news reporters introduce a delegitimizing trope or theme or undercurrent or thought into the protest, oftentimes with not even getting to the issues of the moral basis, the fundamental basis of why the protest is happening in the first place. The reliance on official sources gets to the same thing that I was, this idea of privileging the institutional narratives over that of the protesters. And so when protest stories, and then you have reporters who interview officials like police chiefs, officials such as a mayor, officials such as a sheriff, they tend to feature those people with authority in ways of that transmits authority, that conveys credibility and legitimacy. To be sure, oftentimes in these stories, you will see one of these official actors with a flag in the backdrop in their blue uniform behind a sea of microphones, giving a much more weighty or official tone to their narrative and to their storytelling. And in doing all of that and relying, for example, on official sources and invocation of public opinion and the hypermilitarization, the violence and the use of metaphors regarding war and disruption, there's a delegitimization of the protests and the protesters. And if not a delegitimization, an outright demonization of the protesters, right? And this too, once again, is aided and abetted by militarized police presence. There was a study done of news stories of over 20,000 protests over like a 30-year period. And the aim of that story, or I'm sorry, the aim of that study was to determine whether or not looking at these news protests, determine whether otherwise equally threatening protest events were more likely to be policed when there are African-American participants present, and to learn whether once at an event, what police did. And that study of 20,000 protest events as described in news stories indeed revealed that protest events with African Americans present were more likely to be policed. And the police, once there, were more likely to make arrests, more likely to use force, or use force and violence in combination with arrest, right? And found statistically significant that race did in fact affect the probability of various policing strategies being deployed above and beyond the actual threat posed by protester behavior. And so as a result, this is what we see with regards to the protest. And this is an example of one that happened this summer. In contrast to the Reopen Michigan protests that we saw in the summer, where you have white actors, white agents yelling at or through masked but non-reinforced police officers just standing there, right? In contrast to the images that we saw with regards to the George Floyd protests. And so we can see countless examples of the difference by which these protests are depicted. But in fact, a recent study looked at the Black Lives Matter protests over the summer and looked at almost 8,000 of them that were linked to the BLM movement in about 2,200 locations, finding that over 9 in 10 were peaceful protests. Right? That might seem far away from the images that we would assume, or I should say the numbers that we would assume based on what we see on the news or read in the news every day. But this is what was revealed. And just like that, in terms of what we see on the news and the impressions that are formed about an event or about a place, thinking about Portland, and if any of you followed the Portland protests, one would readily and consistently given the impression that the entire city was engulfed in flames, if not a significant portion of the city, when in fact, it was basically a 6-block area, even fewer blocks than that was in fact the site of the protests going on in Portland. And moreover, we have this phenomena that we're seeing more and more of now, of these agents who are there specifically to rouse and cause violence and cause damage. For example, the Aryan cowboy in Portland. And we've seen it time and time again throughout the protests, where these protests have been infiltrated by by white supremacy groups or individuals acting to cause disruption and to turn sentiment away from Black Lives Matter and its overall objectives. And in doing so, it allows it justifies the police presence and the police use of force, but more importantly, I won't say more importantly, but just as interestingly, it also gives the media the opportunity to not differentiate between the uprising, the pleas and the protests for change, and damage and criminality that is seen about loot as it regards looting. So by not making a difference or a distinction between legitimate protests and what's happening to the damage to property, it is allowing to give people the impression that the cause is illegitimate. With regards to the militarization and its impacts, the Department of Defense, this 1033 program that authorizes with Department of Defense to disperse high-grade military equipment to municipalities around the country, has been in effect for at least 30 years. And over that time, there's been over almost 3.5 million orders through 11,000 police agencies over 50 states, and $7.4 billion in equipment, from tanks to tear gas to vests to rubber bullets. All of these weapons that we see deployed are a product of these 1033 programs, where these cities and these agencies can get this material out. All right. And so what that does is reinforce this whole idea of a warrior mentality. When we put police in vests, in bulletproof vests, when we give them high-grade weapons, when we give them tanks, when we give them clubs to use on protesters and citizens, we give them tear gas, what we are doing is we are reinforcing and reimposing this us versus them mentality. And they, in fact, have this warrior mentality that of us versus them, that they can use these weapons, these weapons against protesters, right? It's been well documented and shown that the presence of the militarization of police has a feedback loop response, in terms that it begets violent response in some of the protesters, right? The third perverse impact of this militarization is, once again, it reinforces the crime narrative that media are so fond of and so fond of running with, because once again, we have something very visual, we have something that is noise, and it is something that has cognitive impacts. I'm going to just spend 2 minutes, and I want you to listen to a news story. And even more, as you listen, I guess, and watch. Can you see breaking news? Okay, all right. As you watch, at some point, just close your eyes and listen for just a few seconds. Watch and close your eyes for a few seconds, and then watch some more, okay? Here we go. Can you hear?
Brian, before you share your screen, you might have to click on the bottom left-hand corner. There's a button that says optimize sound or something like that.
Yeah, I think it's a checkbox, Brian.
Okay, optimize sound.
When you
You have to
do the
stop sharing and then start sharing. Sorry.
yeah, when you do the share your screen thing, before you click
Okay.
on the thing that you want to share, I think there's
Okay,
a
yes,
little box
yes,
there.
gotcha. Ha. I love people who know more than me.
Listen, I learned that the hard way. I learned that the hard way, brother.
Okay, good looking out. Let's see here. Okay, I think all right, I think that's it. This is the one we want. I think so. All right.
We tired of hurting.
You can take this off and stand with us.
Police clashing with demonstrators in downtown Cleveland after hundreds, if not thousands, gathering to protest the tragic death of George Floyd. Thank you for joining us on this Saturday evening. I'm Chris Fry, and thank those are watching right now on Channel 19. This is a special edition of 19 News at 10 o'clock. What started as a peaceful event took a chaotic turn, eventually leading to the city enacting an 8 p.m. curfew. Our Jim Nelson was there all day, and he has this report from before the curfew went into effect.
After several hours of tension between protesters and police, things came to a relatively calm standstill outside the Justice Center. The tear gas that we had seen thrown from police toward protesters, and then protesters picking them up and returning fire toward police, again slowing down. But nonetheless, it was a tense day, tense situations downtown Cleveland. Protesters and police clashing.
We tired of hurting. We tired of hurting.
It began as a peaceful demonstration protesting the death of George Floyd and other black men and women at the hands of police.
Get it across to law enforcement around the country that they have to do better. We have to do better as a society.
After peacefully marching through the streets, tension grew outside the Justice Center, the building that houses the courts and the Cleveland Police Department. Some tried breaking the glass at the front entrance, hurling water bottles at police, who responded with tear gas, flashbangs, and pepper spray. Crowds dispersed momentarily. As this went on, protesters started picking the tear gas up, launching the canisters back at police.
You can take this off and stand with us.
Windows shattered, buildings vandalized, vehicles set on fire, including this minivan, and at least 2 Cleveland police cruisers. Some protesters reported they were shot with rubber projectiles. Crowds eventually deteriorated, if only for the time being. Those who remained hopeful that their original message isn't lost in the chaos.
It simulates all the way from the top all the way down. And so, we're just looking for better partners at the end of the day.
We, of course, will continue to follow the situation both on air and online. Downtown Cleveland, Jim Nelson, 19 News.
All right.
So that particular story has a lot of features that I was trying to highlight. One, just sort of to begin with, it's basically its construction and deconstructing its components, right? Where you have the selection of events that are not just where the violence predominates the story, leading to the violence, and the violence being the major part of the story. And also, you got clashes that occur. In addition, you have the militarization of the police officers. You have the response of the protesters that are in the streets, and this hyper focus on violence and unrest as opposed to peace and stability. And often some of the reporters' phrases saw or described the protesters as the antagonists as opposed to protagonists. So that's why I wanted to highlight that story as an example. Now let's go back to the screenshot. All right. Come out of here, just a moment. Trying to get my oh, it's still not working. All right. All right. I guess I'll just talk. I'm going to go back to my my PowerPoint. I'll just talk. We were talking about the 1033 programs, but I wanted to explain why, again, once again, why media matters and why it matters in terms of the storytelling. And it has to do with the media influencing beliefs, if not attitudes, of people who are viewing the news, who are listening to the news, etc. And so that and that's the main reason. There are two media theories or mass media theories at work here that I use and I try to apply. And one is called the cultivation theory. And the cultivation theory has it that stories and images that are spread across all genres, news, fiction, nonfiction, entertainment, sports, they have consistent patterns in the portrayal of specific people, of Black people, for example. And for heavy television viewers, particularly, where most people still get their news, particularly local television, that is, say, heavy viewers, that is, who view more than 4 hours of TV a day, long-term exposure to a relatively stable set of messages cultivates their perceptions of given subjects. And that perception can be wildly inaccurate sometimes, right? And so, for example, people who, this is an old example, but people who watch soap operas overestimate the divorce rate in the United States, right? And people who, in fact, who see a lot of crime on television take on what they call this mean world phenomenon, this mean world idea, this idea that the world is violent and there's nothing I can do about it. And that's even so, even despite the fact that, in fact, crime statistics in that particular person's neighborhood is quite low. But heavy television viewing and this adoption of this mean world theory cultivates a belief that crime is higher than it in fact is. Right? Then you have this other mass media theory called priming, and this idea that the short-term impact of exposure to a mass-mediated stimulus, it has impacts on subsequent judgments or behaviors. Right? So media, that's medium priming effects. And that is rooted in cognitive psychology and cognitive science. And it's a heuristic by which we gather, or we gain, or we access information, stereotypes, right? We make snap judgments based on stereotypes. And that is a type of priming activation where we immediately go to, we see something and it immediately triggers something that is in our recesses that we can access. And then we then apply that idea, that notion, those judgments about that thing or that event that we're seeing. And we see this priming have very real effects in terms of stereotypes and in terms of how majorities view Blacks, in fact. So we know, for example, that there's media biases that, as it regards Blacks, that are a real phenomenon. I looked at the identification of prejudicial information in the ABA that's listed by the American Bar Association. Looking for media stories about crime and whether those identification of prejudicial information around Blacks was prevalent when we talked about crime stories, or when we viewed or read crime stories. So we look at the prior convictions of a defendant, whether or not a news story talks about prior arrests, whether or not there are negative statements about the defendant's character or reputation, whether there was a defendant's confession or admission, whether the defendant refused to make a statement, the suspect's performance on any examination, for example, the possibility of a plea of guilty, whether or not that was in a story, and the possibility, or to say the opinions or guilt or innocence of the particular defendant. And the results of that study was that 19% of the defendants described in crime news stories were associated with at least one of those categories of potentially prejudicial information. Blacks and Latinos were twice as likely as whites to be associated with prejudicial statements on local television news. And Latinos who victimized whites were almost 3 times as likely as white defendants to be associated with prejudicial information. This just highlights just one of many disparities, racial disparities in news broadcasts and print as it regards minorities and marginalized groups. One being that in national news, Blacks are underrepresented as police or law enforcement officers. Blacks are underrepresented as crime victims, underrepresented as, and whites are overrepresented as crime victims. But on local news broadcasts, Blacks are grossly overrepresented as crime perpetrators, underrepresented in benign roles, such as newsreaders, such as helpers like police officers or medical staff, EMT staff. And Black focused stories were 2.5 times more likely than white focused stories to be about crime. We saw some of these evidence in the stories that came out of the local protests and the local uprisings. Like, for example, the day after the first major uprising here, one of the stories that ran on Fox News talked about the cleanup efforts that were going on downtown Cleveland. And in almost every shot of that 1.5-minute story, the reporter was interviewing whites or the camera was showing white people sweeping up debris, boarding up houses, boarding up stores, and did not show Blacks in those same roles and performing those same acts, right? That give one, and so one takes away from the impression that Blacks were only concerned about looting or what have you, and were not interested in cleaning up, right? And so that's an example of Blacks being underrepresented in what a benign or a helpful role. The other impact of why media matters here, and I'll be done in about 5 minutes or less, is that you have this phenomenon going on called interreality, where this over-representation of Blacks associated with criminality and Black protests being delegitimized through its association with crime and criminality and violence and disruption, is that they, in contrast, begin to perpetuate this idea of white heroes, that the trope becomes the focus on white heroes and who will bring stability to the disruption. It allows the viewers and listeners to those stories to engage in quotidian talk, everyday talk about ethnic blame, who's to blame for the ills that we're seeing on television, that we're reading about every day. And it is the marginalized or oppressed, is what they would say. There's also this inner reality of what we call incognizant racism. The idea that it's implicit bias, that some biases, some racism we engage in, that is to say white reporters engage in, they don't even know they're engaging in. So the selective biases, the descriptive biases that white reporters and white news editors engage in is a result of this this phenomena that they don't even think about. They're not even aware of what they're doing in terms of how they select stories, how they frame stories, and how they talk about stories. That also feeds into the economic interests of the media outlet. The idea that media is driven by advertising and eyeballs, and the belief that perhaps the belief that if they focus on these things, that is to say, the majoritarian view of what they would like to see, and that is more news about crime, more news of where Blacks and marginalized groups are framed in a negative light, then they're going to keep producing those types of stories. And finally, these stories have a very real impact on not just attitudes and beliefs and how we think about the claims that are being made, but policy choices, right? Where we have seen emerge out of all of these protests, particularly the Black Lives Matter protests and uprisings, all of these bills that legislation, local as well as state and even some national legislation that basically is going to, one, attempts to repress First Amendment freedoms, and two, repress particularly these forms of uprisings, particularly at targeting Black Lives Matter protests. So you have what they call hit and kill bills, where seeking to relieve liability of people who were in vehicles who hit a protester, right? You have this attempt to subject Black Lives Matter and its members to Racketeer Influence and Corrupt Organizations Act, or RICO conspiracies and legal actions against them based on RICO. You have the keep moving ordinances that were found unconstitutional but are used constantly still in other jurisdictions, where a group of 5 or more people cannot be congregated and standing still for more than 5 seconds, or they're subject to arrest. You have critical infrastructure laws where highways, where oil pipelines, if they are seen to be threatened, there are heightened criminal sanctions that are imposed for those people who are protesting and damaging those things. You have Blue Lives Matter laws, which seek to heighten criminal sanctions for people who kill police, which is thoroughly redundant. And these are just some examples of policy choices that are made that arise out of these protests and the impressions that are given with regards to the claims made by African Americans and their allies in these particular cases. Just to conclude, I just want to just briefly summarize basically that news media, more than anything, fundamentally, I think is what I call a site for the struggle for reality and contested realities, where you have groups or individuals who are attempting to construct their reality of the world. And you have a conflict, and you have these counter narratives of those and others, particularly institutional agents, who are working against that. And so there's this constant struggle that we see in these news stories about the construction of one's reality and the construction of one's self and one's identity. And we attempt, while we attempt to frame ourselves and take our own agency with regards to our bodies and how we are viewed and seen as individuals and as a politic, there are forces out there in these stories, in the media institutions and other institutions that work against that. And just through fundamental news gathering processes and routines, we see this interrelationship and interdependence even between the news media and criminal justice and criminal law institutions and courts that work to privilege majoritarian narratives and majoritarian orthodoxies on the stories and the narratives of marginalized groups. And that's basically the main thrust of my conversation. I want to just leave you with that notion and open it up to questions or thoughts. We got a few minutes, I believe.
Attorney Adamson, I did have a question for you. What can be done to mitigate it? Because these stereotypes, these tropes seem to be embedded within the managerial aspects of these business entities, corporate news entities. Do we need an autonomous, independent media, because it seems to me this narrative is very homogeneous and racially homogeneous and class homogeneous in terms of dog whistles, right? And these dog, and so I guess I will conclude that in terms of you don't have to necessarily be rapid or vitriolic. You can be very nuanced in terms of the promulgation of dog whistles. And oftentimes news directors, general managers are very white and very male. And if they're not, even if they're African American, Asian, or Indian, they're very elite in terms of their prism and socialization. So what can be the mitigating, what is the mitigating force? Is that a solution? Autonomous news, independent news, because there's a resource issue with that also.
Perfect. Yeah, I think you're right on both. I think the answer is more diversity in the newsrooms and in the editorial rooms, right? I do think independent news outlets are important, but like you say, they are because they may lack resources that can't compete with, for example, a Fox or even an MSNBC. And so I do think that that's useful and helpful, but they do not, at least in the short term, would not even have the power or influence or spread of any major new network. I think the first answer is what you penned at the outset, is that the lack of diversity in the newsroom.
Does diversity, I guess, in addendum, does diversity mean a class consciousness? Because what I found out, we got many black faces in high places, and what have you. And the bottom line is they don't speak for those who are under the realm of $25,000 a year, $15,000 a year, $10,000 a year. They don't speak to that audience. So the question becomes, after the 60s and 70s, that once those begin to get degree African Americans, Asians, or whatever, or women, or whatever, or black, or Indian, that they still are very genuflect to a European sensibility and tone. So could you respond to that? Because to me, it is much more deeper and richer than just to have a black woman, a black man in a position, when in fact those in a certain income level, a certain experience are still left out.
Yeah, I don't think you're absolutely right. I think you're absolutely right. I would add one more thing to that too, to sort of reinforce what you're saying there. That regardless of the hue and the diversity of the newsroom, they're still going to be subject to the same economic constraints and imperatives. It's all advertiser driven, and so they're going to do in a lot of ways what gets the eyeballs, what gets the clicks, the same as their maybe their white counterpart. So yeah, it's not a clear and simple answer for your solution to your point precisely.
James, did you have a question?
Yeah, more like a statement to add to what Bryan is talking about. And we might want to take into consideration and look at Noam Chomsky's book, A Manufacturing of Consent. And this came out in 1988. And so we've dealing with 32 years of what he talked about then, but it's development over the 32 years. Now, one of the things I want to add to that is at the think tank in 2012, we were sitting in the room for the main speaker, the hip hop guy. I can't think of his name right this minute, but I asked a question about Facebook, or asked a question about social media in general, to which I had about 100 of us. The room was blank. Nobody had an answer. So in the tradition of Marvel, Thanos, I said, fine, I'll do it myself. And I went on Facebook and I started from 2012 to cultivate a group of people. Now, what I want to say about Facebook, though, this goes to Mark's question and Dr. Rhonda's thing about zeitgeist, which I also ask us to keep in mind. See, Noam Chomsky tells us that the media outlets, the fourth estate, is co-opted by the elites and can only present their point of view. What has happened though with Facebook and YouTube, and I've seen this in terms of the Mike Floyd demonstration with my routine from Tuesday morning until Tuesday evening. The provocateur that my mentor called me about it was upset about. They had first shown the provocateur, 2 hours later had identified the provocateur, 2 hours later had shown several of them in the audience from different groups that were all providing provocateurs. Shows the effect of Facebook in terms of presenting more realistic and on the ground media stuff. Now, what I'm trying to say about that, which I think is important, Facebook claims to have a viewership of over 2 billion people across the world. If that's true in any kind of way, it transcends all of this. We're going to try to manufacture the narrative and all that. And I've seen several things where the narrative coming out of the official narrative was one thing, and Facebook blew that stuff out the water. And that's not to say you can trust everything on
James,
Facebook. Yeah.
There's one more question, and we're 2 minutes before the next session. So
okay, I'm sorry.
No, I appreciate your comment and highlighting the importance of the impact of social media. Can't be lost here. Maria, I think you wanted to ask a question.
Hey everyone, those are such great comments. There's so much more we could talk about, especially the provocateur, but I want to take us to kind of a root of it. My concern is that violence in our society it's legitimate to use violence. What I want to know is how do we change the narrative so that violence is never legitimate? Because right now we have my violence is right, your violence is wrong. And what I would like to see is violence across the board be delegitimized. But even in the most radical circles, people are reluctant to say that they can't use counter violence. So I was wondering if you could speak to that.
Yeah, I think that is a great question of how we get there. I do think, though, we have to start with what the state does and the way in which the state enacts violence against the people, and not just the violence against the people, but its selective enactment of violence against a group or individuals. We have to first dismantle that because it is the state that has the greatest and most lethal and dangerous weapons with regards to that. Many people view the counter responses to state violence, such as looting or destruction of property, as a legitimate response, and certainly when we are comparing violence, in no way, shape, or form equating equal to the violence that is done by the state, particularly upon bodies. How do we get to that? I really don't know. I'd be interested in hearing other people's responses if we had time to begin to have that conversation too. Maybe in another context we will and can.
Yeah, I've been quite intrigued by the notion of state violence and plan to have further discussions around that through SJI. We're out of time. We have another session that started at 2:00. It's on Indigenous cultures. I encourage everybody to toggle over with us there. I think Mark Chupp went to go start it. So Dean Adamson, my sincere thanks to you for taking the time to have this conversation with us, and to all of you who joined us. Really, really thankful for your presence, and we'll see you in the next room.
Thank you very much. All right, bye-bye.